It's a spring morning in the year 1258. You're living in Baghdad, the most advanced city on earth. 1,000,000 people, libraries holding centuries of knowledge, hospitals practicing medicine that won't reach Europe for another 200 years. The streets are filled with scholars, poets, engineers. This is the center of civilization itself. And then you see the dust. At first, it's just a line on the horizon, maybe a caravan, maybe traders. But it doesn't stop growing. It spreads, left and right, wider, darker. And then you realize it's not dust from the road, it's dust from 10,000 horses, 100,000 horses, moving like a single organism, controlled, deliberate, unstoppable. The Mongols have arrived. What happens next is almost impossible to believe. In 7 days, just 7 days, the greatest city in the world is gone. Libraries burned, the Tigris River running black with ink from 1,000,000 books, bodies stacked so high the streets are impassable. Survivors would later say you could smell Baghdad burning from 50 miles away. And here's the part that should terrify you. This wasn't special. This wasn't the Mongols at their worst. This was just Tuesday for them. Because by the time they reached Baghdad, they'd already done this to hundreds of cities. They'd conquered more land in 25 years than Rome did in 400. They'd built an empire so vast that if you started walking from one end to the other, you'd die of old age before you finished. They killed so many people, we're talking tens of millions, that forests grew back across Asia because there was nobody left to farm the land. The Earth's temperature actually dropped because of how many people they removed from existence. But here's what's crazy, and this is what nobody tells you about the Mongols. They weren't just destroyers. They invented the postal system. They created the first international law code. They gave us religious freedom, meritocracy, paper money, pants. Yes, pants. They connected East and West for the first time in human history. They made the Silk Road safe. They spread ideas, technology, and culture across continents. One historian called them the bloody architects of the modern world. And he's not wrong, because the people who did all this, they started as illiterate nomads. No cities, no written language, no farmland, just horses, bows, and an idea that would reshape the planet. They were outnumbered everywhere they went. They faced armies with better armor, better weapons, better funding, and they won every single time. So how? How does a confederation of scattered tribes from nowhere conquer half the known world? How do you go from sleeping in felt tents to ruling from Korea to Hungary? How does a people with no infrastructure crush empires that had been around for 1,000 years? That's what we're going to find out. Over the next hour, we're diving deep into the Mongol world. Not the mythology, not the Hollywood version, the real thing. From the moment Genghis Khan was born, and trust me, that story alone is insane, to the moment his grandsons stood at the gates of Vienna 3 generations later, wondering if they should just take Europe too. We're talking strategy, culture, daily life. The truth about Mongol women, who were way more powerful than you think. The psychological warfare that broke empires before a single arrow was fired. The logistics of moving 100,000 soldiers across a continent with no supply lines. The reason why they were so brutally, horrifyingly effective at ending cities. And yeah, we're going to talk about the violence because it was real, it was calculated, and it worked. But we're also going to talk about what came after. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, when you could walk from Beijing to Baghdad carrying a sack of gold and nobody would touch you. When ideas moved freely, when the world got smaller. The Mongols didn't just destroy the old world. They rebuilt it. And then they vanished. And most people today don't even know their names. So buckle up, because this is the story of how a man born clutching a blood clot in his fist, yes, really, conquered more of the earth than anyone before or since. This is the story of empires that thought they were invincible, learning they very much were not. This is the story of the Mongols, and it is absolutely wild. Before we ride further into this story, I'm curious, when you think of the Mongols, do you imagine ruthless conquerors or one of the most fascinating empires in history? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring brutal history like this, consider subscribing. There are many more incredible stories ahead. Across the endless grasslands of Central Asia, the world stretches wide and raw. The sky is an ocean here, blue so deep it feels bottomless, and beneath it, the wind carries the scent of wild horses and dry earth. There are no cities, no walls, no marble palaces, only the rolling steppe cut by rivers that freeze in winter and flood in spring. To live here is to live with the wind, to eat what you hunt, to move when the herds move, and to survive by the strength of your clan. It is in this vast and unforgiving land, sometime in the late 12th century, that a boy named Temujin was born. His people, the Mongols, were not yet the terrifying name the world would come to know. They were scattered tribes, herders and hunters, raiders and survivors, who fought among themselves for grazing land and water. Power belonged to those who could keep their people fed, safe, and loyalty was fragile. Temujin was born into hardship. His father, Yasuge, was a respected chieftain, but not a great one. His mother, Hoelin, had been taken by Yasuge from another tribe, as was the custom of the steppe. Women were sometimes carried away as trophies of war, their fates bound to the strength of their captors. Yet Hoelin would become one of the most formidable women in Mongol history. When Temujin was still a child, Yasuge was poisoned by a rival clan during a feast. His death shattered the fragile protection his family had known. Almost immediately, his followers abandoned Hoelin and her children, leaving them alone on the cold steppe. Imagine this, a woman and her young children, surrounded by nothing but wind and emptiness, forced to scavenge roots and small rodents to survive. They were not only poor, they were outcasts, marked for death by any tribe that might find them. Temujin's first memory of power, then, was of its absence. It's difficult to picture the boy who would one day conquer half the known world, beginning his life in hunger. But perhaps that hunger is what shaped him most. The Mongols lived by a brutal code. Survival demanded unity, but pride and vengeance ran deep. Tribes rose and fell overnight, and for a boy without a father's protection, every encounter was dangerous. Temujin learned to watch people closely, to read the tone of a man's voice, the flicker in his eyes before he drew his bow. It was said that by the time he was 10, he had the stare of someone who saw more than he should. When he was still a youth, his family's struggle turned violent. His half-brother, Bektur, grew jealous of the power Temujin was beginning to show. One day, in a fight over food, Temujin killed him, an act that would stain his conscience and harden his heart. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was control. And then came betrayal. Temujin was captured by the Taichiud, a rival tribe who had once followed his father. They bound him in a wooden kang, a heavy collar that pinned his arms and kept him as a slave. Nights in the steppe were freezing, and the collar cut into his neck every time he tried to move. For many men, that would have been the end, but the boy refused to break. He waited, he watched, and when an opportunity came, when a sympathetic family left him unwatched, he escaped. He ran for miles across the frozen plains, hiding in rivers, covering himself in mud to avoid being seen. When he finally found his way back to his mother, his body was bruised, but his mind was sharper than ever. From that moment, Temujin carried one belief that would define his life: no one survives alone. The Mongols respected strength above all else, but Temujin began to see that strength wasn't just in muscle or skill with a bow, it was in unity. The tribes of the steppe were fierce, but divided. He dreamed of binding them together under a single banner to end the endless cycle of betrayal and revenge. But that dream was dangerous. On the steppe, power was personal. To unite the tribes meant challenging every chieftain who held it. Still, Temujin's charisma was undeniable. Slowly, he gathered allies, men who admired his discipline and fairness, even in a world where fairness was rare.
Among his earliest companions was Gelme, who once found Temujin wounded and near death and gave him his own food and care. Then there was Jamuka, Temujin's childhood blood brother. They swore loyalty to each other, bound by the Mongol oath of Onda, a bond said to be deeper than kinship. For a time, they fought side by side, raiding rival tribes, sharing spoils, building their small following. But even friendship on the steppe was fragile when ambition grew. Jamuka wanted to rule the old way, with fear, with wealth, with family ties. Temujin wanted something new, a meritocracy, where loyalty mattered more than birth. When word of this spread, the steppe began to stir. Some called him a visionary, others called him a threat. By his late 20s, Temujin's camp had grown into a force. He rewarded those who served him well, whether they were nobles or slaves, and punished betrayal swiftly. He reorganized his followers into Arban, Zun, and Mingan, erasing tribal lines. It was an army not of tribes, but of warriors bound by discipline and code. Still, unity came at a price. His old friend Jamuka saw this growing power and turned against him. They would soon clash in one of the bloodiest civil wars the steppe had ever seen, brother against brother, dream against tradition. But that is for later. For now, the wind still blows across the open grasslands, and Temujin still rides with the small band that believes in him. The steppe is wide, the stars endless, and the boy who once starved beneath them is beginning to rise. It's strange to think how history turns, how a single childhood of hunger, of loss, can forge someone into the kind of man who would one day be known as Genghis Khan. He was not yet that name, not yet the ruler of millions, not yet the terror of empires. He was still just Temujin, a survivor, a dreamer, a son of the steppe. But already you can feel it. The world is beginning to shift beneath his feet.
The wind on the steppe carries stories farther than men can walk. It carries tales of friendship and betrayal, of battles fought and blood spilled, of brothers who once swore loyalty under the same sky and later drew blades against each other. Temujin and Jamuka were once such brothers, bonded by the Onda oath, a promise older than any written word, sealed not by paper but by the shared cut of a blade. For a time, they rode together as one. Their camps moved across the grasslands, their horses drinking from the same rivers, their warriors sleeping beside the same fires. The tribes that joined them believed the two young leaders would bring peace to the steppe, an end to centuries of chaos. But peace has never been the nature of men born to struggle. Jamuka was a man of the old order, proud, charismatic, and cruel when crossed. He came from noble lineage, and to him power flowed through bloodlines. He rewarded those of high birth and punished those who disobeyed. Temujin, in contrast, had no noble father to rely on. His years of starvation had taught him something else, that strength can come from anywhere, and loyalty is worth more than heritage. As the months passed, their differences became cracks. Those cracks widened into fault lines. The warriors began to whisper. Some admired Jamuka's grandeur, his wealth, his traditional ways. Others saw in Temujin a kind of discipline and fairness rare in this harsh land. When Jamuka demanded the return of deserters who had joined Temujin's side, the boy from the cold steppe refused. That refusal marked the end of their brotherhood. Their forces met on the plains near the Onan River. It is said that when they rode out to face each other, the grass itself trembled under the weight of thousands of hooves. The sound of it, a living thunder rolling across the land, could be heard from miles. Jamuka's army was larger, more ornate, his men dressed in furs and silks taken from conquered tribes. Temujin's army was smaller, leaner, his men clad in plain leather and armed with what they could forge or steal. But discipline favored Temujin. His warriors moved in formation, each arban and zone obeying their commander's word with precision. The battle raged from dawn till dusk. Arrows darkened the sky,
Horses fell, screams carried through the dust, and the steppe ran red with blood. Temujin's forces fought in smaller units, each man trusting the other, using speed and coordination to outmaneuver their enemy. Jamuka's army was fierce but scattered, and by sunset, his lines began to break. Temujin won that day, but his victory came with horror. Jamuka, furious at the betrayal of his own men, captured 70 young warriors who had turned to Temujin and executed them by boiling them alive. The message was clear: betrayal would not be forgiven. But the act only hardened Temujin's resolve. He began to see that unifying the Mongols would not come through fear, it would come through justice, or at least something that felt like it. The tribes needed laws that transcended blood. He envisioned a new order where all were equal beneath the Khan, bound not by tribe, but by loyalty and service. Slowly, Temujin rebuilt. More clans came to him: the Jadaran, the Jurchen, the Tatar who once fought his father. To each he promised fairness. To each he offered protection. And when they broke his laws, he punished even his own followers without mercy. There was a story told of one of his men who stole a horse from a fellow soldier. Temujin ordered the thief executed, even though he had fought bravely in battle. The message rippled across the plains. In Temujin's camp, the law was the only master. He reorganized his growing army into groups of 10, a system that ignored tribal ties. A man from the Merkit could serve beside a man from the Taichiud, and their loyalty would be to each other, not to the blood that had once divided them. He even began to collect orphans from conquered tribes and raise them as his own soldiers, teaching them to fight, to ride, to survive, to live and die for a single purpose. It was around this time that Temujin began to forge new alliances. He sought the friendship of Togrul, the Khan of the Karit, one of the most powerful in the region. Togrul had known Temujin's father and saw potential in the young leader. He offered him protection, warriors, and recognition. Together, they began to challenge Jamuka and his allies. In one campaign, Temujin's army ambushed a Tatar camp at dawn. The Tatars had long been enemies of his people, the same tribe that had poisoned his father years before. For Temujin, it was more than a battle. It was revenge dressed in justice. The slaughter was swift and merciless. The survivors were executed or enslaved, and their lands were absorbed into his growing realm. Revenge was a language the steppe understood well, but what made Temujin different was that his vengeance always served a larger goal. Every battle, every tribe absorbed, every alliance made, all of it moved him closer to his vision of unity. He was still not yet Genghis Khan, not yet the master of half the world, but the steppe was beginning to change. The name Temujin was whispered with both fear and admiration. Mothers used it to quiet their children at night. Rival Khans began to watch him with unease. And as the wind swept over the grasslands, carrying the smoke of burned camps and the cries of the defeated, a legend began to root. The boy who had once starved beside his mother was becoming something else, not just a survivor, not just a leader, but a force of nature. The tribes of Mongolia had always lived like the wind, free, fierce, and divided. But soon, for the first time in history, they would all be bound under one name. The world was about to meet its first great Khan.
When the wind of the steppe grows too still, the Mongols begin to move. The horizon, endless and silent, becomes their invitation. By the year 1211, Genghis Khan had already forged a nation out of dust and blood, but now he looked southward toward a civilization of cities and walls, gold and silk, scholars and emperors. The Jin dynasty of northern China was one of the wealthiest empires on earth, and to the Mongols, wealth was a challenge. They had once traded with the Jin, sending horses, pelts, and women in exchange for tea and grain. But the Jin had always looked down upon the people of the north, calling them barbarians, herdsmen, ghosts on horseback. Once they had even demanded that Genghis himself come to their capital and kneel as a vassal. He never forgot that insult. So when the spring grass returned to the plains, he summoned his generals, Subutai, Jebe, Gelmay and his sons, and together they rode toward the Great Wall. But here was the genius of Genghis Khan. He did not throw his men blindly at stone fortresses. He understood that walls are only as strong as the men behind them, and that men, unlike walls, can be broken. Before the main campaign began, he sent small, fast units to raid the Jin frontier. Villages burned, caravans vanished, panic spread. The Jin emperor, believing the Mongols were no more than a nuisance, sent a massive army north, over 300,000 men, to crush them. The Mongols pretended to retreat. For days, they lured the Jin troops deeper into the steppe, into empty grasslands where there was no water, no shade, no food. And then, when the Jin were exhausted and scattered, Genghis unleashed the full force of his army. It was not a battle, it was an erasure. The Mongols surrounded the Jin from all sides, cutting off their escape. Their arrows fell like rain, horses screamed, the sky turned black with dust. By nightfall, the Jin army was gone, not defeated, but annihilated. The survivors fled to their walled cities, but the Mongols were patient. They did not siege the walls in rage, they studied them. They captured Chinese engineers, learned how to build catapults, siege towers and traction trebuchets, and turned the technology of civilization against its makers. By the next year, the Great Wall itself had been breached in multiple places. The Mongols flowed through the cracks like water, dismantling the Jin defenses city by city. One story says that Genghis Khan stood before the fortified city of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, and said quietly, "I will make the ground here so flat that you can ride across it without stumbling." It took a year of siege, starvation, and fire, but he kept his word. Zhongdu fell in 1215, its palaces looted, its fields turned to ash. But even in victory, Genghis did something unexpected. He spared the scholars, the engineers, and the physicians. To him, knowledge was worth more than gold. He had the Chinese bureaucrats reorganize his administration. He had the scribes record his decrees. The man who could not read himself was now building the framework of an empire that would one day span half the world. And yet, amid the triumph, there was always the shadow of death. The Mongol way demanded that loyalty be absolute. One of Genghis's generals, a man named Jochi, his eldest son, began to question his father's methods. He believed mercy might build a greater world than fear. Genghis did not argue. He simply grew silent. In the Mongol world, silence was more dangerous than anger. The Jin dynasty collapsed under the pressure of fire and horsemen. Refugees fled south, and the world began to realize that the Mongols were not a passing storm, they were the climate itself. After the campaign, Genghis returned to the steppe. The grass was greener than he remembered, his people were richer, his warriors stronger, but his eyes were still fixed on the horizon. He knew the Jin were only the beginning, because beyond China lay other empires, the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, the lands of Persia and Samarkand, the Silk Road kingdoms that connected east to west. And in the great Khan's mind, a single thought began to take shape. If there is one sky above the earth, there should be one ruler beneath it. That idea, simple, absolute, and terrible, would soon unleash the most devastating invasion in the history of the medieval world. The Mongols had conquered their first empire, but next they would go to war with the world itself.
It began as many empires do, not with an army, but with a hunger for order, for belonging, for a way out of the chaos that the steppes had endured for generations. By the time Temujin had become a young man, the Mongols were a shattered people. Tribes warred endlessly over pastures, herds, and pride. Blood feuds could last decades, and alliances shifted like the wind. But from that disorder, a single idea began to take form: unity. Temujin was not born to power, he carved it out of the dirt. The boy who had once watched his family starve began to rise by understanding something that older, more powerful men never did, that strength on the steppe wasn't just measured by muscle or speed, but by loyalty. And Temujin learned how to bind men not through fear, but through faith. He began small. He gathered a handful of outcasts, men who had been abandoned by their own tribes, widows who had lost their families, and shepherds who had no herds. They followed him not because of his lineage, but because of how he treated them. He shared every hardship with them, every scrap of meat, every night by the fire. When they were ambushed by rival clans, Temujin fought in the front lines, shoulder to shoulder. It wasn't long before the word spread that this son of Yasuge was no ordinary leader. The first to join him in earnest were the remnants of his father's old followers. One by one they drifted back, drawn by stories of his courage and fairness. Among them was Borsu, a loyal companion who became like a brother, and Jelme, a fierce warrior who would later save Temujin's life by sucking poison from his wound on the battlefield. These were not just followers, they were the beginnings of something sacred, a brotherhood forged in the cold winds of the Mongolian plains. By the 1180s, Temujin had begun to build his strength through the one tool no one else could wield as effectively: diplomacy. While other chiefs relied on family ties, Temujin broke tradition. He married into alliances, but also created bonds of anda, sworn brotherhood, with other powerful figures. One of them was Jamuka, a charismatic and noble-born Mongol with whom Temujin shared a deep and complicated bond. Together they dreamed of uniting the Mongols, but it would not last. Their friendship would fracture into one of the most defining rivalries in steppe history. For a time, Temujin and Jamuka ruled together. They split command of their warriors and divided responsibilities. Yet as their power grew, so too did their differences. Jamuka represented the old ways, noble-born, traditional, steeped in the tribal hierarchies that had ruled the steppes for centuries. Temujin represented something new, a meritocracy, a world where loyalty mattered more than blood, where even a shepherd could rise to command if he proved himself in battle. The breaking point came when Jamuka executed Temujin's men by boiling them alive, a brutal message that the steppe would not easily change. But instead of retreating into vengeance, Temujin did something remarkable. He reorganized. He began to create a new structure, one that turned the chaos of nomadic warfare into disciplined order. He divided his followers into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands. Each man knew his commander, and each commander knew his men. Loyalty flowed upward and downward through the ranks. The tribes that joined him didn't just pledge fealty, they became part of something larger, something that transcended bloodlines. Temujin's army was not merely a force of destruction, it was a model of efficiency. Supplies were distributed equally, plunder was shared fairly, decisions were made collectively among trusted generals, men like Subutai and Jebe, who would one day become legends in their own right. Even those who opposed him began to notice that Temujin's camp was different. There was discipline, there was respect, and in time, there was fear. By 1190, the name Temujin began to echo across the steppe. Rivals saw in him both a visionary and a threat. He crushed those who resisted, but spared those who submitted. The defeated were not slaughtered, they were absorbed, given a place in his growing order. Every conquest made him stronger. Every enemy who bowed became a soldier under his banner. There's something almost paradoxical about it. The man who would come to represent ruthless conquest built his empire on loyalty, unity, and fairness. He didn't just demand obedience, he inspired it. In 1201, a great council, a Kurultai, was called by the rival Mongol tribes. They declared Jamuka as Gur Khan, the universal ruler of all the Mongols, in open defiance of Temujin. But fate was no longer on their side. Temujin struck with precision and fury. His forces overwhelmed Jamuka's coalition, scattering his enemies and capturing thousands. Those who resisted were destroyed. Those who surrendered were welcomed.
It was after this victory that Temujin's legend became irreversible. He had united most of the steppe under his command. His next step would be to formalize what everyone already knew, that he was the chosen leader of all Mongols. In 1206, the tribes gathered once more on the banks of the Anan River. This time, there was no opposition. The air was thick with smoke from the fires and the scent of horse sweat. Warriors stood in ranks that stretched to the horizon. Shamans performed ancient rituals, calling upon the spirits of the ancestors. And as the sun rose over the steppes, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. It was a moment that transformed the world. The man who had once been left to die in exile was now emperor of an empire that had yet to be built, but would soon touch every corner of Eurasia. The title of Genghis Khan wasn't just symbolic, it marked the birth of a system. He enacted laws known as the Yasa, a code that governed everything from the treatment of prisoners to the conduct of battle, trade, and family. He banned the kidnapping of women between tribes, outlawed theft among his followers, and ensured that religious leaders of all faiths were to be respected. The steppe had never seen such order. And it wasn't just order, it was destiny. For the first time in Mongol history, the clans that had warred for generations were united beneath one banner. Tens of thousands of horsemen trained in perfect synchronization, ready to ride in any direction their Khan commanded. Messengers sped across vast distances carrying orders and news, linking the farthest encampments into a single living network. The world beyond the steppes, the kingdoms of China, the Khwarezmian Empire, the Rus principalities, had no idea that a storm was forming. To them, the Mongols were still the same wild tribes they had always been. But in truth, the steppe had awakened. It was the calm before the greatest storm in human history. And as Genghis Khan looked out over his newly united people, the winds of destiny began to move. The empire he was about to unleash would reshape continents, topple dynasties, and connect civilizations in ways no one could yet imagine. It all began here, in the vast silence of the Mongolian plains, with a man who refused to be broken, and a people who had finally found their purpose.
The steppe had finally gone quiet. After generations of blood feuds, betrayal, and endless motion, the Mongol tribes were united under one name, the name of Genghis Khan. But peace, for men like him, was only a moment between storms. And now that he ruled the steppes, his eyes turned toward the south, toward China. It was not the China we know today. In the early 13th century, the land was divided into rival empires, fractured, wealthy, and vulnerable. To the north lay the Jin dynasty, the rulers of northern China who controlled the Great Wall and the fertile plains beyond. To the south lay the Song dynasty, prosperous and refined, whose cities glimmered with silk and porcelain. And between them were smaller kingdoms, each filled with riches that the Mongols could only imagine. For centuries, the Mongols had traded and raided across the northern borders of the Jin. They brought furs and horses and received silk, grain, and iron in return. But the Jin treated the steppe peoples with disdain, as barbarians, tolerated only when useful, despised when not. To them, the Mongols were a nuisance, not a threat. But that arrogance would cost them their empire. In 1210, when the Jin emperor demanded that Genghis Khan submit as a vassal, paying tribute like the other steppe chieftains before him, Genghis refused. Instead, he sent a message: "I am the punishment of heaven." The Mongols began to move. Their approach to war was unlike anything the Chinese had ever faced. The Jin armies were vast, organized, and disciplined, but they were bound by walls and slow-moving supply lines. The Mongols, in contrast, were wind and fire, fast, flexible, and devastating. When the first Mongol scouts crossed the Gobi Desert, the Jin commanders underestimated them. They saw a few thousand horsemen and assumed this was another raid.
But then the raids became invasions, full armies appearing seemingly out of nowhere, moving with impossible coordination. Each Mongol warrior carried 3 or 4 horses, switching mounts mid-ride to stay fresh. Their composite bows could pierce armor from 200 meters away. And when cities fell, the Mongols learned quickly. Siege warfare, once their weakness, became their obsession. They captured Chinese engineers, blacksmiths, and siege masters, absorbing their knowledge and improving upon it. In 1211, Genghis Khan led 200,000 Mongol soldiers into northern China. The campaign was swift and brutal. Fortresses that had stood for generations fell one by one. Mongol tactics were precise. They would surround a city, cut off supplies, and bombard it with catapults until fear itself became the greatest weapon. Those who surrendered were spared. Those who resisted were wiped from the map. The Great Wall, meant to keep the steppe out, failed spectacularly. Mongol cavalry simply rode around it, finding the weak points, crossing through mountain passes, and emerging deep behind enemy lines. It was as if the wind itself had turned against the Jin. At first, the Mongols struggled with the scale of the Chinese cities, immense walled fortresses with thick defenses and food reserves that could last for years. But Genghis Khan adapted. He divided his armies into multiple columns, attacking on several fronts at once. When one city resisted, another was captured behind it, cutting off reinforcements. The Mongols mastered the art of psychological warfare, releasing captives to spread tales of destruction, demanding surrender in exchange for mercy. By 1213, the Mongols had encircled the Jin heartland. Panic spread through the northern plains. Refugees clogged the roads, and entire villages fled before the sight of the horsemen. Even the sky seemed to favor them. Dry winds carried the dust of the steppes southward, clouding the sun and turning day into twilight. In 1215, the Mongols reached Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, the great capital of the Jin. For months, the city endured a siege unlike any other. The defenders watched from their walls as the horizon filled with Mongol tents, smoke, and catapults. Genghis Khan ordered his men to encircle the city completely, starving it of food and hope. When Zhongdu finally fell, it burned for days. Contemporary Chinese accounts describe streets filled with ash, rivers running red, and a silence that followed like a tomb. It was not conquest for conquest's sake. To Genghis, it was justice, revenge for years of humiliation, tribute, and insult. He believed that heaven had chosen him to punish the corruption of the settled empires, to remind them that the earth belonged not to those who built walls, but to those who could ride beyond them. But Genghis was not blind to wisdom. As he conquered northern China, he did something extraordinary. He preserved its engineers, scholars, and administrators. He sent emissaries to study Chinese systems of taxation, communication, and law. The Mongols were not destroyers of civilization, as many imagined. They were absorbers of it. Wherever they conquered, they learned. The Mongol army moved like an organism, each part supporting the other. Scouts rode far ahead, mapping terrain. Messengers relayed information with incredible speed, using a system of relay stations called the Yam. Supply lines were flexible, organized, and efficient. The Mongols could feed an army of tens of thousands in lands that no traditional force could survive in. And yet, Genghis Khan's genius was not only in strategy, but in psychology. He knew how to make the world fear him before he even arrived. When he sent emissaries to a city demanding surrender, he always gave them a choice: open your gates and live, or resist and face extinction. Word spread faster than the horses themselves. Many cities surrendered before the Mongols even appeared. But victory came with its burdens. For every city taken, the Mongols lost men, horses, and time. The Jin capital had fallen, but the dynasty still lingered, retreating south beyond the Yellow River. Genghis could not yet pursue them. The steppe called him back, and the Western Front demanded attention. Still, what he had achieved was nothing short of miraculous. In a few short years, a people once dismissed as mere nomads had toppled one of the most powerful empires in Asia. The Mongols had proven not just their strength, but their adaptation. They had become masters of siege, diplomacy, and governance. When Genghis Khan returned north, he left trusted generals to rule the conquered territories. The Jin would eventually fall entirely, but already the world had changed. For the first time, the Mongols had stepped beyond their homeland and won. Imagine it for a moment. The vast Mongolian steppe, silent under the weight of twilight. Thousands of tents stretch as far as the eye can see, fires flickering against the wind. Horses graze quietly under the moonlight. And at the center of it all sits Genghis Khan, the man who turned scattered tribes into a nation. His gaze is steady, his thoughts reaching beyond the horizon. He knows this is only the beginning. The conquest of China was not the end. It was a rehearsal, a preparation for the greater wars that would follow. And beyond the mountains, across deserts and rivers, lay new worlds to conquer. Central Asia, Persia, the cities of the Silk Road. The Mongols would soon ride west, and the world would tremble once again.
By the time the fires of Zhongdu dimmed, the Mongol Empire was already restless again. Victory in China had proven their power, but it had also shown them something else. The world beyond the steppes was vast, wealthy, and vulnerable. And so, when Genghis Khan turned his gaze westward toward the rich cities of Central Asia, he was not dreaming of conquest alone. He was thinking of trade. The Mongols wanted silk and silver, gold and grain, but above all, they wanted connection. They were nomads, yes, but they understood routes, movement, and exchange better than anyone. To them, the Silk Road was not just geography. It was a living artery that could feed their new empire. And at the center of that artery stood the Khwarezm Empire. The Khwarezm Shah ruled over a prosperous realm stretching from modern-day Iran to the Aral Sea, linking east and west through bustling cities like Bukhara, Samarkand, and Urgench. These were cities of domes and markets, of scholars and astronomers, of mosques that shimmered with blue tiles under the desert sun. To Genghis Khan, they seemed like a natural ally. To the Khwarezm Shah, they were a threat. In 1218, Genghis sent a caravan of merchants and envoys west, hundreds of men carrying silk, gold, and horses, bearing peaceful offers of trade. They came under the white banner, the Mongol symbol of diplomacy. They were unarmed. But when they reached the city of Otrar, the governor there, suspicious and arrogant, accused them of spying. He seized the goods, executed the men, and sent word to the Shah. And the Shah did nothing to stop it. When Genghis Khan heard of it, his response was measured, almost calm. He sent another delegation, 3 men this time, directly to the Shah, demanding justice and the governor's punishment. It was a test of respect. The Shah, feeling untouchable in his distant empire, humiliated them instead. He shaved the beards of the Mongol envoys, an unthinkable insult, and sent one back alive to tell Genghis Khan what he had done. That act sealed his empire's fate. For Genghis Khan, war was never chaos, it was order. The punishment for insult was total annihilation. In 1219, the Mongols crossed into Khwarezm territory with an army so vast that contemporary chroniclers struggled to count it. Some said 200,000, others whispered 500,000. But it was not just numbers that made the invasion terrifying, it was precision. They came in 4 great columns, moving like water,
splitting apart and flowing around mountains, deserts, and rivers. They struck at once, at Otrar, at Bukhara, at Samarkand, each one a jewel of the Islamic world, each one falling faster than anyone thought possible. When the first Mongol riders appeared outside Bukhara, the people thought they were local bandits. Days later, the city's great mosque was filled with Genghis Khan's soldiers, their boots muddy, their eyes cold. And then, silence. Genghis himself entered the mosque, mounted on horseback, and looked at the scholars and townsmen before him. He said, according to Persian chroniclers, "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." The words echoed through history like a curse. The Mongols did not simply sack Bukhara, they dismantled it. Every artisan, scholar, and laborer of use was spared and sent to serve elsewhere. The rest were scattered to the wind. By the time they reached Samarkand, resistance was already faltering. The Khwarezm Shah fled, abandoning his capital, his soldiers, and even his family. He crossed the mountains in disguise, chased by Mongol detachments, until he died alone on a barren island in the Caspian Sea. But Genghis Khan was not satisfied. He wanted the memory of betrayal to vanish from the earth. The city of Urgench, the jewel of Khwarezm, resisted longer than the others. It took months of siege and flood to bring it down. When it finally fell, the Mongols destroyed it stone by stone. Historians claim tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands were slain. The Amu Darya River ran red, and for years afterward, the land around Urgench was said to be haunted by silence. Still, even in destruction, there was logic. The Mongols used terror as a language, a way of speaking to the next city, the next empire, the next ruler who might think to defy them. Word spread faster than their armies, and the world began to realize that the Mongols were not just conquerors, they were a force of nature. But this campaign did something deeper. It connected east and west like never before. The Silk Road was reopened under Mongol control. Caravans began to move again, now protected by Mongol patrols instead of harassed by them. Trade flourished, ironically, in the aftermath of destruction. From China to Persia, a single empire now stretched across the heart of Eurasia, bound not by bloodlines or faith, but by fear and efficiency. Yet in the quiet after victory, something had changed in Genghis Khan. The man who had begun as a survivor, then a conqueror, now ruled half the known world. But power brings questions that war never answers. He called for scribes and scholars to record laws, to unify the empire under a code called the Yasa. He invited Chinese engineers and Persian administrators to serve under his rule. He tolerated religions, encouraged learning, and began to imagine something far greater than conquest, a world order built on mobility, trade, and law. Still, the shadow of Otrar lingered. For every city burned, every massacre remembered, the Mongol name grew darker in foreign tongues. To those who lived through it, they were not rulers, they were the storm itself. And yet, under that storm, the Silk Road began to bloom again. Caravans moved freely, cities rebuilt, and for the first time in centuries, goods and knowledge flowed between Europe and Asia without interruption. Paper, gunpowder, silk, and science moved west. Gold, medicine, and philosophy moved east. The world was changing faster than anyone could understand. The Mongols had burned Khwarezm to ash, but from that ash, they built the beginnings of a global empire. When Genghis Khan returned to the steppe, he was no longer just a conqueror. He was the Khan of Khans, the world's greatest general and the architect of the largest land empire in history.
When the dust of Khwarezm finally settled, something remarkable happened. Something the world didn't expect from the Mongols, the so-called horsemen of ruin.
For the first time in centuries, the roads across Asia were quiet. No bandits, no wars between kingdoms, no border taxes that strangled trade. Just the sound of wheels creaking across the ancient Silk Road and the distant echo of hooves, not as conquerors this time, but as guardians. Historians would later call this era the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. It began in the ashes of empire, yet it became one of the most transformative periods in human history. The empire of Genghis Khan now stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. His sons and generals ruled vast regions, each different in culture, language, and faith, yet all united under one law, the Yasa. The Yasa wasn't written in stone, it was fluid, adaptable, but its message was clear: loyalty, order, and obedience. No theft on the roads, no fighting without permission, no interference with envoys or merchants. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road became safe again. Caravans that once carried silk and spices now added paper, glass, medicine, gunpowder, and knowledge itself. Persian astronomers met Chinese mathematicians. Indian traders debated Arab scholars in the markets of Bukhara. The world had never been so connected. And at the center of it all, the Mongols watched. They didn't just rule by fear anymore, they ruled by efficiency. Every 50 miles along the trade routes, there were relay stations, yam posts as they were called. At each post, fresh horses waited. Couriers carrying royal messages could travel thousands of kilometers in days. A letter could move from Beijing to Samarkand faster than it would move across medieval France. This network became the nervous system of the largest empire the world had ever seen. Merchants, monks, spies, and explorers moved through it freely, all under the Khan's seal of protection. Even Marco Polo, the Venetian traveler who would one day fascinate Europe with tales of the East, owed his journey to this system. But peace under the Mongols was not peace as others understood it. It was controlled stability. Each conquered land was allowed to keep its faith, its language, its traditions, as long as it paid tribute and obeyed the Khan's laws. In Persia and the Middle East, the Mongols employed Islamic scholars as administrators. In China, they studied Confucian bureaucracy. In Russia, they ruled indirectly through local princes. It was empire as architecture, built layer by layer, each piece fitting into the next, bound by the threat of swift and total punishment. Yet within that structure, something strange blossomed: exchange. A Persian doctor might treat a Mongol general with Chinese herbs. A Christian monk might translate Buddhist scriptures into Latin. A Muslim astronomer might use Greek geometry to map the stars for the great Khan. The Mongols didn't care where knowledge came from, only that it worked. This was the genius of their rule. They saw the world not as a map of enemies and allies, but as a network of movement and use. To them, the value of a culture was not in its boundaries, but in its ability to flow. And so, for nearly a century, the Pax Mongolica reshaped the world. Trade routes flourished. Cities like Karakoram, Samarkand, and Beijing became global crossroads. Even Europe, still crawling out of its own dark ages, began to feel the tremors of this new interconnected world. Gold and silk arrived in Venice and Genoa. Gunpowder, paper, and compasses began to circulate westward. The Renaissance, centuries later, would owe part of its spark to the Mongols' brutal efficiency. But all peace has a cost. To sustain such an enormous network, the Mongols demanded absolute discipline. The same roads that carried merchants also carried spies and soldiers. Any rebellion was met with immediate retaliation. The peace of the Mongols was not freedom, it was order born from the memory of fire. Still, for travelers crossing the deserts of Central Asia or the mountains of Tibet, the difference was real. They could move without fear,
protected by the Khan's banners. And at night, in the flicker of caravan fires, they would tell stories. Stories of Genghis Khan, the man who had united the steppes, burned empires, and somehow, through all the violence, had created peace. Even in the far corners of Europe, kings and popes sent envoys eastward, curious about the horsemen who ruled the world. Some came seeking alliances, others came seeking salvation. All of them returned with the same message. The Mongols were not savages, they were an empire of laws, roads, and vision. The steppe had become the spine of civilization. In the capital city of Karakoram, foreign ambassadors once watched as Buddhist monks, Muslim imams, and Christian priests prayed side by side. There was no harmony, not really, but there was tolerance. The Mongols had no single god to impose. They believed, as Genghis once said, that heaven had many faces and each man could see his own. For the first time in a fractured medieval world, it seemed possible that humanity could share a single network of trade, communication, and respect. Of course, it wouldn't last. After Genghis's death, his sons and grandsons would inherit the empire, and soon ambition, greed, and pride would begin to crack its unity. But before that collapse came, the Mongols had achieved something no one else ever had. They had turned fear into order and conquest into connection.
The world had never seen a man quite like Kublai Khan. He was born into dust and thunder, grandson of Genghis Khan, heir to an empire that stretched beyond imagination. But unlike his ancestors, Kublai wasn't content to live his life on horseback. He had a different dream, not of conquest, but of civilization. When Kublai was still young, he rode through the valleys of northern China. He saw rice paddies glittering in the sun, stone bridges over silver rivers, and libraries filled with thousands of scrolls. It fascinated him. The Mongol way was simple and strong, but China was something else. Ancient, intricate, deep, and he wanted to understand it. As he rose in power, Kublai surrounded himself with Chinese scholars, engineers, and advisors. He studied Confucian law and Buddhist philosophy. His court was filled with translators, astronomers, and mathematicians from across Asia. To his people, he was still a Khan, but to China, he began to look more like an emperor. When his elder brother Mongol Khan died, the empire once again fractured into factions. The struggle for succession ignited a civil war that spanned years and thousands of kilometers. And when the dust settled, it was Kublai who remained standing, the ruler not of a tribe, but of the world's richest civilization. In 1271, he made his declaration. The Mongols would no longer rule as outsiders. They would become the new dynasty of China. He named it the Yuan dynasty. And in that moment, the steppes met the Middle Kingdom. Imagine Beijing, then called Khanbaliq, city of the Khan. Not yet the capital we know today, but already vast, gridded, and gleaming with ambition. Kublai ordered the construction of palaces, temples, and gardens. The marble terraces were lined with golden roofs, the air thick with the scent of incense and lacquer. He wore Chinese robes and performed the rituals of the emperor, but he never forgot who he was. His throne room echoed with the rhythm of both worlds, Confucian order and Mongol steel. Under Kublai, the empire reached its cultural peak. Trade from Persia to the Pacific surged again. Persian glass met Chinese silk, Indian ivory mixed with Siberian furs. The Grand Canal was repaired, linking the fertile south to the northern capital. For the first time in centuries, China was united and the world was connected to it. And yet, beneath the splendor, there was unrest. The Chinese, proud and ancient, saw the Mongols as foreigners. They resented the new hierarchy that placed nomads above scholars.
The Mongols, in turn, feared losing their identity. They were warriors born from freedom, not courtiers born from etiquette. Even Kublai himself struggled with this divide. He wanted to be both Khan of the steppes and Emperor of China, but those two worlds were drifting apart. His court reflected that tension. The Mongol generals whispered of lost traditions, while Chinese ministers debated Confucian morality. Even in art and architecture you could see the split: yurts beside palaces, horsemen beside mandarins. Still, Kublai believed in synthesis, in building something greater from both halves. He invited foreign travelers to his court, eager to hear how the world saw him. Among them was a young Italian from Venice, Marco Polo. Marco's arrival was like a spark in a dark room. He described a city larger than any in Europe, filled with canals and markets, guarded by elite soldiers on horseback. He wrote of paper money, a concept almost magical to the West, and of vast postal systems, of fireworks that split the sky in color. To European ears, his stories sounded impossible, but he had seen them with his own eyes. And more than anything, he saw the man behind it all, Kublai Khan, the ruler of worlds. Marco described Kublai not as a barbarian, but as a wise, soft-spoken man with deep, dark eyes and a curiosity that never faded. He questioned everything: trade, religion, science, art. He wanted to understand how the world worked. Perhaps that was his greatest strength. He was not just a conqueror, he was a student of humanity. Under Kublai's rule, tolerance became law. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Confucians all served in his administration. There were mosques, churches, and temples built side by side. The Khan believed in a single truth, that heaven had many names. He appointed Muslim engineers to design irrigation systems, Persian administrators to manage taxes, and Chinese scholars to teach his sons. His empire was not bound by blood, but by ability. The Mongol ideal of merit before birth lived on through him. But as the years went by, the weight of empire began to show. The further he moved from the steppes, the more his own people grew restless. They said the great Khan had grown soft, too Chinese, too distant, and perhaps, in some ways, he had. Kublai dreamed of uniting not only China, but the islands beyond. He launched massive naval invasions against Japan, fleets larger than the world had ever seen, but twice the sea betrayed him. Typhoons ripped his armadas apart. The Japanese would call them kamikaze, divine winds. Tens of thousands of Mongol soldiers vanished beneath the waves. It was a turning point. For the first time, the unstoppable empire had been stopped, not by an army, but by nature itself. And from that moment, the cracks began to show. The Mongol Empire, stretched too thin, began to drift into separate worlds. Kublai still ruled China, but the other Khanates, in Persia, in Russia, in Central Asia, followed their own paths. The unity that Genghis had built through fear and fire had become a web of distant echoes. Yet Kublai Khan endured. In his old age, he withdrew more and more into his palace. He ate lavishly, drank heavily, and grew immense, unable to walk, yet still commanding millions. Even so, he remained curious. He surrounded himself with poets, philosophers, and musicians. He wanted to leave behind not just an empire, but an idea that the Mongols could be more than conquerors. When he died in 1294, the empire he ruled began its slow unraveling. But his dream, a world connected by roads, trade, and tolerance, outlived him. In the centuries to come, those same roads would carry something else westward: new ideas, new technologies, new empires. And in every traveler's tale, in every whisper of a faraway city, there was still the shadow of the Khan who had dreamed of peace through understanding.
Empires rarely fall in one day. They fade, like a fire that once burned too bright, leaving embers in the dark. After Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the Mongol world began to unravel. What had once been a single storm moving across continents broke apart into drifting winds. Each Khanate, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China, turned inward, seeking its own survival. And yet, for a time, the memory of Genghis still lingered. Every ruler claimed his blood, every banner still bore his mark, the horseman and the bow. But beneath the surface, they had begun to forget what had made them powerful in the first place. The Mongol genius was never just war, it was unity. It was the shared belief that every tribe, every religion, every soldier belonged to something greater than themselves. But now the Khans ruled distant worlds that no longer touched. The steppe riders who once charged side by side now fought each other across deserts and mountain passes. In Persia, the Ilkhanate prospered for a time. Cities like Tabriz and Baghdad became centers of art and science again, rebuilt after the devastation of earlier conquests. But they depended heavily on trade routes, and when those routes faltered, when the Silk Road grew dangerous again, the economy began to crumble. The Ilkhanate collapsed within a century, torn apart by dynastic disputes and rebellion. In Russia, the Golden Horde ruled with a heavy hand. The Rus princes paid tribute in silver, in slaves, in submission. But the horde itself was changing, slowly absorbing Slavic culture, converting to Islam, and losing touch with the steppes. By the 15th century, their dominance had faded. From its ashes would rise a new power, Moscow, which would one day rule the world in its own way. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate became a patchwork of oases and rival warlords. The ancient Silk Road that had once united Asia under Mongol protection turned dangerous again. Caravans traveled under armed guard, bandits ruled the passes. The Chagatai lands splintered, some turning Islamic, others clinging to old traditions. And in China, the heart of the empire began to rot from within. The Yuan dynasty that Kublai had built was immense, but also fragile. The Mongols were a tiny minority, ruling over tens of millions of Chinese subjects. They faced droughts, floods, and famines. Corruption spread through the court. The once disciplined administration became bloated with greed. Taxes soared, rebellions flared. The Mongols had conquered China through discipline and mobility, but now they had become what they once despised: sedentary, decadent, divided. The 14th century brought another blow, one that no army could fight. From the plains of Central Asia came a silent enemy: the Black Death. The very trade routes the Mongols had opened now carried plague instead of prosperity. From the steppes to the cities, from Persia to Europe, the disease moved faster than any horse. Entire villages vanished, armies collapsed before a single battle. Historians estimate that between a third and a half of Eurasia's population perished. It was a catastrophe that broke the rhythm of civilization itself. The Mongol Empire, already weakened, could not survive the weight of death. And yet, even in decline, its influence remained extraordinary. The idea of connectedness, of one world, was irreversible. The postal systems they built inspired later empires. The routes they secured allowed the exchange of inventions like gunpowder, paper, and the compass. Their religious tolerance set an early precedent for multi-ethnic governance. Even after the Khanates disappeared, the memory of the Mongol century lingered. Europe, once isolated and fearful, now dreamed of the East, of trade, exploration, discovery.
When Marco Polo's book spread across the continent, it awakened a generation of explorers. Men like Christopher Columbus would set sail not to conquer, but to rediscover what the Mongols had connected. In that sense, Genghis Khan's empire never truly died. It transformed from horse and bow into map and compass. But before that new age could rise, one last flame flickered on the steppe. His name was Timur, or Tamerlane. He was not a direct descendant of Genghis, but he claimed the legacy, and more importantly, he embodied the spirit of it. Born near Samarkand, he rebuilt the art of war that had once defined the Mongols. His campaigns stretched across Persia, India, and Anatolia, burning cities and rebuilding them in his image. He dreamed of uniting the Mongol world again, but his empire, like all before it, died with him. By the late 15th century, the steppes that had once thundered with hooves grew quiet. The Mongols became part of the fabric of the lands they had conquered, no longer conquerors, but citizens of new nations. The fall of the Mongol Empire was not a tragedy, it was a transformation. What began as a storm ended as a network. Ideas, languages, and technologies crossed borders that no one would have imagined before. They had changed the world permanently. Even now, when you hear the word empire, a shadow of their story still lingers behind it, the memory of riders who connected the edges of the earth.
The world remembers the Mongols for their fury, for the fires they lit across continents, for the rivers that ran red, for the sound of hooves thundering through cities that would never rise again. But when the dust of that storm settled, what remained was not only ruin, it was connection. Across the ashes, a new kind of world had taken shape, one bound together by trade, by faith, by the shared pulse of human movement. When Genghis Khan first rode beneath the endless blue sky, he was not thinking of empire. He was thinking of unity. He was thinking of the tribes that had torn each other apart for generations and of how he could make them one. What began as a dream on the steppe would soon become the largest continuous land empire the earth had ever seen. A single, unstoppable network that stretched from the Yellow Sea to the edge of Europe. Yet the true brilliance of what they built was not its size, but its speed. The Mongols made the world smaller. Through their couriers and relay stations, letters could fly across continents faster than armies. The Silk Road, once broken and dangerous, became alive again. Caravans moved under the protection of the Khan's law. A merchant from Venice could walk the same paths as a scholar from Samarkand, both carrying stories and knowledge between worlds that had once been strangers. China's inventions reached Persia. Persian medicine reached the East. The world was rediscovering itself through Mongol hands. They were conquerors, yes, but they were also pragmatists. They ruled not by blood, but by ability. Chinese administrators stood beside Persian viziers. Arab astronomers taught in Mongol courts. Religion, too, was untied from the sword. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, shamans, all could worship beneath the eternal blue sky. It was said that Genghis Khan once decreed, "All faiths are the same in the eyes of heaven." And perhaps it was this strange sense of fairness, of order within chaos, that allowed the empire to last as long as it did. Their systems would echo far beyond their fall. The Mongol Pesa, a small tablet carried by envoys, acted as a kind of passport, granting safe passage across lands and languages. Their postal network, their census systems, their methods of governance, all would be borrowed by empires that followed. Even the very idea of a single interconnected world began here in the wind-swept plains of the steppe. But time, as always, was the only force stronger than any empire. The Mongol world fractured. The sons and grandsons of Genghis Khan turned their swords on each other. Great khanates rose and fell, and slowly the thunder faded into silence. Yet the silence was not empty.
Today, when you stand in Mongolia, you can still feel it, that immensity. The open plains stretch to the horizon, and the wind moves through the grass like a whisper from another age. Nomads still ride their horses beneath the same sky their ancestors once called eternal. The smell of earth, the weight of distance, the rhythm of the land, all of it remains unchanged. The empire is gone, but the steppe remembers. And in a strange way, the Mongols never truly vanished. Their blood flows in millions across the world, a genetic echo of the men who once conquered half of it. 1 in every 200 men alive today carries the mark of Genghis Khan or one of his descendants. 17 million lives bound by a single lineage born under that vast sky. But their legacy runs deeper than blood. Every cargo ship that sails from Asia to Europe, every aircraft that crosses oceans in hours, every trade route that binds continents together, all of it is in some faint way a continuation of what began 8 centuries ago. The Mongols turned chaos into connection. They tore the old world apart and, without meaning to, built the foundations of the modern one. When we speak of them, we often speak of war, but perhaps what we should remember is motion, the way they moved across the world and how the world still moves because of them. The empire has long since fallen, but its dream, a world without walls, remains. And somewhere in the silence of the steppe, beneath the same blue sky that watched over Genghis Khan, the wind still carries the sound of distant hooves. You've witnessed the rise and wrath of the Mongol Empire tonight, the dust of their horses, the smoke of fallen cities, and the silence that followed their victories. Now the fires are dying, the riders have vanished beyond the horizon, and the empire that once shook the world rests beneath the same quiet sky. Thank you for joining this journey. Make sure you subscribe for more amazing stories from history. If you made it all the way to the end, type the words of Genghis Khan. Conquest yourself, and you conquest the world. Good night and sleep well, traveler.